Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we uncover the darkest and most mysterious tales from around the world. Tonight, as we gather to celebrate Thanksgiving, we delve into the chilling stories that cast a shadow over this holiday. From the infamous disappearance of D.B. Cooper to ghostly visitors and cursed dinner parties, these 10 terrifying tales will make you see Thanksgiving in a whole new light. Dim the lights, settle in, and prepare to uncover the haunting side of this festive season. Story number 1. The Uninvited Guest. Thanksgiving in 1987 was supposed to be a big, joyful event for our family. My grandparents' house in rural Pennsylvania had always been the hub for holiday gatherings. And that year, more than 20 of us had crammed into their cozy old home. It was the kind of place you'd see in postcards. A 2-story colonial with white clapboards and a wraparound porch, tucked away in a quiet suburb. We didn't know that this Thanksgiving would become a story we'd retell in hushed tones. One that would haunt us every year when we gathered to carve the turkey. The day started like any other Thanksgiving. The house was alive with the smells of roasting turkey, mashed potatoes, and pies cooling on the counter. Kids ran around underfoot, their laughter mingling with the sound of clinking dishes and the murmur of adults catching up. The living room was crowded with uncles watching the football game, and my grandmother bustled in the kitchen, orchestrating the chaos with her usual efficiency. We all crammed into the dining room for the feast. The long table was beautifully set, stretching from one end of the room to the other, and everyone took their seats, squeezing shoulder to shoulder. Someone suggested taking a family photo before we started eating, and my dad grabbed his camera, a bulky old Polaroid. "Everyone smile," he called as he positioned the camera on a tripod. The timer ticked down, and the flash went off, capturing the moment. We laughed, shuffled our chairs, and dug into the meal, the photo quickly forgotten as the evening unfolded into a blur of conversation, dessert, and card games. It wasn't until after the party, when my dad developed the Polaroid, that we realized something was wrong. The next morning, I was sitting in the kitchen with my mom, sipping orange juice and eating leftover pie for breakfast, when my dad walked in, holding the photograph. His face was pale. "You've got to see this," he said, sliding the photo across the table. It was the picture we'd taken at dinner. Everyone crowded around the table, smiling and holding glasses of wine. But in the background, standing near the doorway to the kitchen, was a man. He was tall, gaunt, and dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a dark suit and tie that looked like it belonged in the 1940s. His face was pale and gaunt, and his eyes were wrong. They were dark, empty, like 2 bottomless pits. "Who's that?" I asked, my stomach tightening. My mom frowned. "Is this a joke?" "No," my dad said, his voice trembling. "I didn't notice him when I took the picture. He wasn't there. Maybe it's a double exposure," she suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Polaroids can do weird things sometimes. But my dad shook his head. "It's not a double exposure. Look at the way he's standing. He's part of the room. He was there." We spent the rest of the morning going over the picture, trying to make sense of it. No one at the party had seen the man. My mom called everyone who'd been there, and no one recognized him. My uncle even joked that maybe we'd accidentally photographed a ghost, though his laugh sounded forced. That night, as the house grew quiet, I found myself staring at the picture again, the unease growing. There was something about the man's face that I couldn't shake, something that made my skin crawl. His expression wasn't angry or menacing. It was empty, like he didn't belong. Couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside, sent my imagination spiraling. I kept picturing the man standing in the corner of the dining room, his hollow eyes watching us. The next day, we searched the house. My dad insisted it was for peace of mind, though I could tell he was rattled. We checked every closet, every room, even the attic, but there was no sign of anyone. The doors and windows had all been locked the night of the party, and there were no signs of forced entry. Maybe it really was just some kind of camera glitch, my mom said, though her voice lacked conviction. But my dad wasn't convinced. That night, he locked every door and window twice, leaving the porch light on and a baseball bat by the front door. Over the next few weeks, little things started happening around the house. Objects would move, chairs slightly out of place. Doors that had been closed left ajar. My mom swore she heard footsteps in the hallway late at night, but when she got up to check, no one was there. My younger cousin, who had been staying with us for the holidays, refused to sleep in the guest room anymore, saying she felt like someone was watching her. And then there were the scratches. We found them on the back of the dining room door. 3 long, deep grooves that hadn't been there before. My dad blamed the dog, though we all knew the dog never went into the dining room. By Christmas, the tension in the house was unbearable. My dad eventually put the Polaroid photo in a drawer, out of sight but never out of mind. We stopped talking about the man, though his presence lingered, a silent shadow over our family. Years later, I showed the photo to a friend who was into local history. She stared at it for a long time before asking where it had been taken. "Why?" I asked. "This man," she said, pointing to the figure in the background. "He looks like someone I read about. There was a murder in your area, back in the 1940s. A man killed his family at Thanksgiving dinner. They found him standing in the dining room, holding a knife. When the police arrived, he just disappeared. I felt the blood drain from my face. What happened to him? They never found him," she said. "It's like he just vanished. I don't know if the man in the photo was a ghost, a trick of the light, or something else entirely. I don't know why he appeared that night, or why he chose our family. But every Thanksgiving since, I can't help but glance at the doorway when we gather around the table, half expecting to see him standing there, watching, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still hear the creak of footsteps in the hallway." Story number 2. The Thanksgiving disappearance of Joseph. Thanksgiving 2018 was supposed to be a happy reunion. Our family had all gathered in my parents' cozy house in Colorado, tucked away near the edge of a forest that stretched for miles. The house was always warm and inviting, especially during the holidays, with the smell of turkey and pumpkin pie wafting through the air and the sound of laughter echoing through the rooms. But that Thanksgiving, the laughter stopped. Joseph, my cousin, went for a walk after dinner and never came back. A year later, when they found him, the answers they gave us only brought more questions. Questions I still ask myself every time I think about that night. Joseph was the kind of guy everyone loved. 28, he had an easy charm, the kind of smile that put people at ease. He was quiet but warm, always ready to lend a hand or crack a joke at just the right moment. That Thanksgiving, he seemed happier than usual, catching up with relatives, teasing the younger kids, and helping my dad carve the turkey. After dinner, as we all sat around the living room, full and content, Joseph said he needed some fresh air. "I won't be long," he said, grabbing his coat. "You sure?" my aunt asked, glancing at the darkening windows. "It's getting cold out there." Joseph waved her off with a smile. "Just a quick walk. Clear my head." None of us thought twice about it. The forest had always been a familiar backdrop to our gatherings, a place where we played as kids and hiked as teenagers. But as the minutes turned into an hour, and then 2, worry began to set in. "Maybe he went to the gas station," my uncle said. "Wanted to grab a pack of cigarettes." "He quit 2 years ago," my aunt replied, her voice tight. By midnight, we called the police. The search for Joseph lasted weeks. Teams of volunteers combed the forest. Helicopters circled overhead, and the local news plastered his face across their broadcasts. But there was nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no sign that he had ever been there. "It's like he just disappeared," the sheriff told us after the 3rd day, his face grim. "We'll keep looking." But the search was eventually called off. The holidays passed in a haze of worry and grief. and by spring, the family had begun to accept the unthinkable, that Joseph was gone, and we might never know what had happened. Then, almost a year later, a hunter found him. It was late October 2019 when they called my aunt. Joseph's body had been discovered deep in the forest, miles from the house. The hunter had stumbled across him near a cluster of boulders, his body strangely preserved despite the elements. The coroner's report only deepened the mystery. There were no signs of trauma, no wounds, no evidence of foul play. Toxicology tests came back clean. He hadn't starved or succumbed to hypothermia. He had simply died. He looked like he was asleep, the sheriff told us, just lying there, like he'd stopped for a rest and never woke up. But there was one thing that didn't make sense, his expression. My aunt refused to see the photos, but my uncle described it later, his voice shaking. He looked terrified, he said. His eyes were wide open, his mouth half open, like he was screaming. But there was no one there. After the funeral, the family tried to move on, but the unease lingered. The woods, once a source of comfort, now felt oppressive, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. My aunt moved out of the house, unable to bear the weight of her memories. I stayed behind to help pack up, spending long days sorting through boxes and furniture. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, alone in the house, that I found Joseph's journal. It was tucked away in a drawer in his old room, a small leather-bound notebook with a broken clasp. I wasn't sure why I opened it. Maybe curiosity, maybe desperation for some clue, some insight into what had happened to him. Most of the entries were mundane notes about work, random thoughts, sketches of trees and mountains. But the last entry, dated Thanksgiving night, chilled me to the core. Something is wrong. I can't explain it, but I feel like I'm being watched. I thought I saw someone in the trees. A man, maybe, or something that looked like one. He was too tall, his limbs too long, and his face didn't look right. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but the feeling won't go away. The forest is different tonight. The air feels heavier, the trees closer, so quiet I can hear my own heartbeat. I don't know why I keep walking, but I can't stop. It's like something is pulling me deeper. I think I hear whispering, but there's no one here. At least, no one I can see. I showed the entry to my parents, but they dismissed it, saying Joseph had always had an active imagination. He was probably just spooking himself, my mom said, though her hands trembled as she handed the journal back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Joseph had seen something in those woods, something that had followed him, lured him deeper, something that had waited for him to be alone. A few weeks later, I went back to the spot where Joseph had been found. I don't know what I was looking for. Closure, maybe, or some sign that the forest could give up its secrets. The leaves crunched underfoot as I walked, the air colder than I'd expected. The boulders loomed ahead, their surfaces mottled with moss and shadows. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ground where my cousin had lain, trying to picture his last moments. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves, but it was there, a soft, rhythmic murmur, like a voice carried on the wind. I turned, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing, just the endless expanse of forest, dark and unyielding. The whisper came again, closer this time. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't just noise. It was my name, James. I ran. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't even go near them. The journal is locked away in a drawer, and I haven't opened it since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whisper again, faint and fleeting, as if carried from miles away. I don't know what happened to Joseph that night, or what he saw in those woods, but I do know this, whatever it was, is still out there, and it's waiting. Story number 3. The Thanksgiving screams in the Maine woods. We were tired of tradition. That's how it all started. Instead of turkey and stuffing at someone's warm, cozy home. My friends and I decided to break the mold that Thanksgiving in 2017. We'd pack our tents, head into the deep woods of rural Maine, and celebrate with campfire-roasted hot dogs and whiskey. It sounded perfect, peaceful, something unique to brag about later. I didn't know that night would become something I'd never want to talk about again. There were 5 of us, me, Andy, his girlfriend Lila, and our mutual friends Mike and Rachel. We'd been friends since college, a tight-knit group that thrived on doing things differently. The drive to the campsite was long and winding, the sun dipping lower as we turned onto increasingly narrow dirt roads. By the time we parked and unloaded our gear, dusk had fallen, painting the sky in hues of purple and red. The spot Andy picked was perfect, secluded and far from any sign of civilization. Towering pines surrounded us, their dark silhouettes swaying gently in the breeze. A small clearing near a rocky outcrop gave us just enough room for our tents and a roaring fire. It felt like a slice of untouched wilderness. We spent the evening laughing, drinking, and roasting marshmallows over the fire. Rachel played a crackling playlist from her portable speaker, and Lila told a few ghost stories she'd heard growing up in New England. They were fun, harmless tales of lost hikers and eerie lights in the woods. We all laughed and shivered in good spirits. But then, the first scream shattered the night. It came out of nowhere, loud and raw, like a woman screaming in pure terror. The sound cut through the trees, silencing the music and our laughter in an instant. What the hell was that? Lila asked, clutching Andy's arm. An animal, Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. Foxes scream like that sometimes, but it didn't sound like an animal. It was too human. We sat in silence, staring into the dark forest beyond the firelight. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches above us. For a moment, everything seemed normal again, just the woods, the wind, and the crackle of the fire. And then the second scream came. It was closer this time, more guttural, like the cry of something in pain or fury. Rachel grabbed the flashlight, her hand trembling as she swept the beam across the trees. "That's not a fox," she whispered. "No kidding," Andy muttered. He grabbed the axe we brought for firewood, his knuckles white around the handle. "Stay here, I'll check it out." "Are you insane?" I said, grabbing his arm. "You're not going out there alone." "Then come with me," he said. Reluctantly, I grabbed my own flashlight, and we stepped into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around us as we moved away from the fire. The smell of pine and damp earth was thick in the air, the ground soft beneath our boots. Andy's flashlight danced across the trunks, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move. The silence was oppressive. The only sound was our own breathing, harsh and ragged in the cold night air. "Do you see anything?" Andy whispered. "No," I replied, my voice barely audible. Then we heard it, the snap of a branch, just ahead of us. We both froze, our lights trained on the spot where the sound had come from. And then it moved. It was massive. First, I thought it was a bear, but it moved too quickly, too smoothly, darting between the trees with a speed that didn't make sense for something so large. My flashlight caught a glimpse of it, tall, covered in dark, matted fur, its shoulders hunched and its arms long enough to brush the ground. Its eyes flashed red in the light. "Run," Andy whispered, his voice trembling. We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and sprinted back to the campsite, the branches clawing at our clothes as we crashed through the underbrush. Behind us, I could hear it moving, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground, its guttural breathing growing louder. When we broke through the tree line and into the clearing, the others were already packing up, their faces pale and terrified. "We need to go," Lila said, her voice shaking. "Now." Andy grabbed the car keys from his bag, and we piled into the SUV, leaving everything behind. The tires spun in the dirt as we sped down the narrow road, the headlights slicing through the darkness. None of us spoke. The only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. The next morning, We returned with a park ranger to retrieve our gear. The campsite looked untouched at first, just the remnants of the fire, our tents still standing. But when we stepped closer, we saw the damage. The tents had been slashed, the fabric hanging in tatters. The food cooler had been torn apart, its contents scattered across the ground. And on the trees surrounding the clearing, deep claw marks gouged into the bark, too high up to have been made by any ordinary animal. The ranger was dismissive, saying it was probably a bear or a mountain lion. But when we showed him the tracks in the dirt, massive footprints, larger than any humans, with long, clawed toes, his face went pale. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what we saw that night. Maybe it was Bigfoot. Maybe it was something else. Something older. Something that doesn't belong in our world. What I do know is this. If you ever find yourself camping in the woods of Maine and hear a scream in the night, don't try to investigate. Don't try to be brave. Because some things out there are better left unseen. And if you do see them, they might not let you leave." Story number 4. The Faceless Man of Thanksgiving Night. Thanksgiving 2003 was supposed to be like every other year. My family had gathered in our old, creaky house in a small Indiana town, a place that seemed frozen in time, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. It was always warm, filled with the smells of roasted turkey and pies cooling on the counter, and the laughter of family sharing stories around the table. But that Thanksgiving was different. It was the night we met him, the Faceless Man. It started after dinner. We were all lounging in the living room, my cousins half asleep on the couch, my uncle telling one of his long-winded hunting stories. The adults were sipping coffee, and the kids were sneaking extra slices of pie. The house was alive with the hum of conversation, the soft crackle of the fireplace, and the clinking of dishes in the kitchen. Then my mom, who was in the kitchen washing up, called out, "Who's out there?" The room fell silent. My dad looked up from his coffee. "What do you mean? Who's out there?" "There's a man outside," my mom said, her voice tight. "He's standing by the window." We all got up, crowding into the kitchen. Sure enough, there he was. The man stood on the lawn, perfectly still, facing the window. He was tall and thin, dressed in a black suit that looked old-fashioned, like something out of the 1940s. The way he stood, rigid, unmoving, set my teeth on edge. But it was his face that stopped my breath. Or rather, the lack of it. The man's face was blank, a smooth expanse of pale skin where there should have been eyes, a nose, and a mouth. No features, no expression, just emptiness. "What the hell?" my dad whispered, stepping closer to the window. "Don't go out there," my aunt said, clutching his arm. But my dad wasn't the type to be scared by some Halloween prank. "It's probably some kid messing around," he said, grabbing his coat. "I'll scare him off." "No, wait," my mom started, but he was already out the door. We watched from the window as my dad walked across the yard, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Hey," he called, his voice firm. "Can I help you?" The man didn't move. He just stood there, as still as a statue. "Hey," my dad said again, louder this time. He reached out, as if to grab the man's shoulder. And then the man disappeared. It wasn't like he walked away or ran into the shadows. He vanished. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone, leaving my dad standing alone in the yard, his hand hanging in the air. My dad stumbled back toward the house, his face pale. "He's gone," he said, slamming the door behind him. "What do you mean, gone?" my uncle asked. "Did he run off?" "No," my dad said, his voice shaking. He disappeared, right in front of me. We spent the rest of the night locked inside, the curtains drawn, the lights dimmed. My uncle tried to convince us it was just a prank, but none of us believed him. The way the man had stood there, the way he had vanished, it wasn't something a person could do. The next morning, My dad went outside to look for footprints. The ground was soft from the rain the day before, perfect for catching tracks. But there was nothing. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. That's when we found the marks. On the window where the man had been standing, there were smudges, as if someone had pressed their hands against the glass. But the prints weren't normal. They were too long, the fingers unnaturally thin, with no defined ridges or lines. My mom wanted to call the police, but my dad stopped her. "What are we going to say?" he asked. "That a faceless man stood in our yard and disappeared? They'll think we're crazy." Reluctantly, we let it go, but the memory of that night stayed with us, an unspoken shadow that hung over every conversation. Over the years, strange things began happening in the house. We'd hear footsteps in the hallway late at night, but when we checked, no one was there. The lights would flicker, the bulbs burning out faster than they should. My mom swore she saw the man again once, standing at the edge of the yard, but when she blinked, he was gone. We stopped hosting Thanksgiving at the house after that. My mom said it was because it was too much work, but I knew the real reason. None of us wanted to be there, not after dark. I thought I'd put that night behind me until a few years ago. When I was visiting my parents for the weekend, I was going through some old photo albums, reminiscing, when I found a picture from that Thanksgiving. It was a group shot, taken in the living room after dinner. Everyone was there, my cousins, my parents, my aunts and uncles, all smiling and laughing. But in the background, near the window, was a shadowy figure, a man in a black suit. I dropped the photo and backed away, my heart pounding. When I picked it up again, the figure was gone. I don't know who or what the faceless man was. A ghost, a trick of the mind, something darker. I've read stories about similar figures, tales of people encountering strange beings with smooth, featureless faces. They always appear suddenly, silently, and vanish just as quickly. But why he came to us, why he chose that night, I'll never know. What I do know is this: every Thanksgiving, I still feel a chill when the sun goes down. I find myself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see him standing there, motionless, watching. And sometimes, when the lights flicker late at night, I wonder if he ever really left. Story number 5. The stranger on Thanksgiving night. Thanksgiving had always been a big deal for my family. Every year, we'd gather at my parents' house in Connecticut, a cozy, creaky old place tucked away at the edge of a sleepy little town. The smell of turkey and pumpkin pie would fill the air, and we'd laugh and argue and tell the same old stories as the fireplace crackled in the background. It was a tradition I'd looked forward to every year since I was a kid. But Thanksgiving 2012 was different. It started out normal enough. My parents, my sister Emma, her husband Chris, and I had spent the day cooking, eating, and reminiscing. By the time the last slice of pie had been eaten and the dishes had been stacked in the sink, we were all too full to move. We sprawled across the living room, sipping wine and laughing about old times as the clock ticked closer to midnight. The first knock came just as Emma was telling a story about her college roommate. It was sharp and loud, echoing through the quiet house. We all froze, our laughter dying instantly. "Who the hell knocks on a door at this hour?" Chris said, frowning. "Maybe it's a neighbor," my mom suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "I'll check," I said, getting up from the couch. The house felt colder as I moved toward the front door, the creak of the floorboards unusually loud in the stillness. I flipped on the porch light and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. "Is someone messing with us?" Emma asked when I returned to the living room and told them what I'd seen, or hadn't seen. "Maybe some kid pulling a prank," Chris said, though his tone was uneasy. "It's late for that, though." "Forget it," I said. "Probably nothing." We tried to get back to our conversation, but the mood had shifted. The warmth of the evening had been replaced by an unspoken tension. Every little sound seemed louder, every shadow darker, and then came the second knock. This time, it was at the back door. The knock was slower, more deliberate, each thud spaced out as if whoever or whatever was on the other side was trying to draw it out. Chris and I exchanged a glance before getting up. He grabbed the fireplace poker as I grabbed the flashlight. The back door was in the kitchen, a glass-paneled thing that looked out onto the backyard. When we reached it, the porch light was already on, casting long shadows across the frost-covered grass. Standing in the middle of the yard was a figure. It was tall, easily over 6 feet, and dressed in a long black coat that seemed to absorb the light. The figure didn't move, didn't wave or gesture. It just stood there, facing the house, its face obscured by the shadows. "What the hell?" Chris whispered. "Hey!" I called, my voice shaking. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. I stepped closer to the door, my hand tightening on the flashlight. If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. Still, no response. The figure remained perfectly still for another moment. Then, without a sound, turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing beyond the reach of the porch light. When I returned to the living room, my mom was already on the phone with the police. They arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers in a patrol car. They searched the yard and the surrounding area but found nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. They assured us it was probably just a prank and advised us to keep our doors locked. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went outside to see if I could find anything the police might have missed. The frost had melted, leaving the ground damp and soft. I made my way to the spot where the figure had stood, but there were no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been there, except for the marks on the glass. On the back door, just above eye level, were 4 long scratches, as if someone or something had dragged their nails across the surface. The marks were deep, almost etched into the glass, and no one in the house could explain them. "Maybe it was an animal," Chris said, though he didn't sound convinced. "What kind of animal scratches glass like that?" Emma asked. No one had an answer. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I visited my parents' house, I found myself glancing at the backyard, half expecting to see the figure standing there again. The stories started coming out a few months later. Neighbors whispered about strange knocks in the night, about figures seen at the edge of the woods or standing under streetlights. Some claimed their pets had gone missing, while others spoke of waking to find their doors unlocked or their windows open. And always, there were the scratches on glass, on wood, on car doors and house siding, deep, deliberate marks, as if left by something with claws. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that night. The police chalked it up to a prank, a drifter passing through town. But I don't believe that. There was something about the figure, its stillness, the silence, the way it seemed to absorb the light that felt wrong. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if we'd opened the door, if we'd gone outside instead of staying in. I wonder if the figure would have done more than just stand there. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows are long, I swear I can hear it again, the knock. If you ever hear a knock on your door late at night, don't answer, don't look, because once you see it, it might never stop watching. Story number 6. The Thanksgiving Ghost of D.B. Cooper. Thanksgiving has always been a time for family, turkey, and gratitude, but for me, it's a time of unease. Every year, when the leaves turn and the air grows crisp, my mind drifts back to that night in the forest, the night I came face to face with the ghost of a legend. The year was 1995, exactly 24 years after the infamous hijacking by D.B. Cooper. For those who don't know the story, Cooper was a mystery man who hijacked a plane, demanded $200,000 in cash and parachutes, and then jumped into the dark wilderness of Washington state. He vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but rumors, theories, and an endless fascination with his fate. Some people thought he escaped and lived out his days in luxury. Others believed he died in the forest, his body lost to the elements. I never thought much about it until that Thanksgiving weekend, My friend Rob had a cabin near Ariel, Washington, not far from where they believed Cooper had landed. It wasn't much, just a rickety old place with creaky floors and a fireplace that barely worked. But it was enough for our annual Thanksgiving hunting trip. Rob, his brother Mike, and I had made it a tradition, head out to the woods, bag a few deer, drink too much, and pretend we knew how to cook. It was stupid, but it was ours. That year, though, something felt off. We arrived at the cabin on Wednesday night, hauling in our gear and cracking open a few beers. The place was just as I remembered it, dim, cold, and smelling faintly of mildew. Rob was in high spirits, joking about how this would be the year he finally shot something other than empty beer cans. The first night passed uneventfully, but on Thanksgiving morning, the forest seemed different. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. Even the air felt heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "Looks like snow," Rob said, squinting at the overcast sky. "We'd better get moving if we want to find anything." We set out just after sunrise, our rifles slung over our shoulders. The trail was narrow and winding, the trees pressing in on either side like walls of a cathedral. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, until the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the frosty ground. About an hour in, we found the first sign. Mike was the one who spotted it. A scrap of fabric tangled in a bush. It was old, faded, and torn, the edges frayed by time. But it wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to find in the middle of nowhere. "Looks like part of a jacket," Mike said, holding it up to the light. "Weird." "Ha!" I nodded, unease prickling at the back of my neck. "Probably some camper who got lost." Rob shrugged. "Maybe. Let's keep moving." We pushed deeper into the forest, but the atmosphere grew heavier with every step. The trees seemed taller, darker, their bare branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant rustle of leaves. And then we heard it, a faint sound, carried on the wind, soft, rhythmic, and unmistakably human. It was humming. We froze, our eyes darting to the trees. The sound was faint but growing louder, a low, tuneless melody that sent chills down my spine. "Who the hell is out here?" Rob whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, gripping my rifle tightly, "but they shouldn't be." The humming stopped abruptly, leaving the forest in a suffocating silence. And then, from somewhere ahead, we heard it, a single word, spoken in a voice that was flat and hollow, like wind through a broken window. "Run." I don't know who moved first, but suddenly we were running, crashing through the underbrush, the forest a blur of shadows and branches. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where we were going, only that we needed to get away. But the forest wasn't letting us go. The trees seemed to shift, their branches reaching out like claws. The ground was uneven, the roots twisting like serpents beneath our feet. And then, from somewhere behind us, came the sound I'll never forget. A low, guttural laugh, deep and unnatural, echoing through the trees. We burst into a small clearing, our legs trembling, our breaths fogging in the cold air. For a moment, everything was still, and then we saw him. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows. He was tall, his frame gaunt but imposing, his clothes tattered and dirty. His face was pale, almost skeletal, his eyes sunken and empty, but it was the briefcase in his hand that sent a jolt of terror through me. It was old, battered, the leather cracked and peeling, and stenciled on the side, barely visible in the dim light, were the words, "Northwest Orient Airlines, D.B. Cooper." Rob whispered, his voice trembling. The man, if you could call him that, stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes locked onto mine. And in that moment, I felt something I can't describe. It wasn't just fear, it was despair, like he was pulling me into the void with him. And then he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." His voice was a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. The briefcase fell from his hand, hitting the ground with a dull thud, and then he disappeared, fading into the mist like smoke. We didn't wait. We ran, tearing through the forest, our lungs burning, our legs numb. Somehow, we made it back to the cabin, slamming the door behind us and bolting it shut. We didn't speak. We didn't eat. We just sat there, staring at the door, the silence pressing in around us. The next morning, we left. On the way back, I glanced into the forest one last time, and there, standing among the trees, was a figure, a tall, gaunt man holding a battered briefcase, his eyes burning with an unholy light. I haven't been back to Capitol State Forest since. Thanksgiving used to be my favorite holiday, but now it's just a reminder of what we saw that night, of the man who disappeared into the darkness and never came back, of the ghost that still haunts the forest, waiting for anyone foolish enough to enter. If you're ever near Mount St. Helens and you hear humming in the trees, do yourself a favor, don't follow it. Story number 7. The Thanksgiving Murders of Charlie Lawson. Thanksgiving has always been a time for family, food, and gratitude, but for me, it's also a reminder of something darker, something I can't forget, no matter how hard I try. It was Thanksgiving of 1998 when my cousin Jake decided we should visit the old Lawson house in North Carolina. Jake was always into weird stuff, urban legends, haunted places, that sort of thing. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I went along anyway. I figured it'd be an adventure, something to laugh about later. We should have stayed home. The Lawson family tragedy isn't just a story around here. It's a warning. Back in 1929, Charlie Lawson, farmer, killed his wife and 6 of his 7 children before turning the gun on himself. The murders happened on Christmas Day, not Thanksgiving, but in the weeks leading up to it. The Lawsons had celebrated Thanksgiving like any other family. People said Charlie had even bought his family new clothes and taken them into town for a formal portrait, as if he'd known it would be their last. The house where it happened still stands, abandoned and rotting, tucked away in the woods like it's trying to hide from the world. Locals say the place is cursed, that the spirits of the Lawson family linger there, trapped in a loop of rage and despair. I didn't believe it until that night. It was cold and overcast when Jake picked me up. The sky a dull gray that seemed to press down on everything. The drive to the house took about an hour, winding through narrow country roads lined with skeletal trees. Jake was in high spirits, cracking jokes and talking about how we'd be the first ones in years to step inside. "I bet it's nothing," he said, grinning. "Just an old house with a creepy story." "Yeah," I muttered, staring out the window. "Probably," but the closer we got, the heavier the air felt. By the time we pulled up to the overgrown driveway, my chest was tight, my skin crawling with a feeling I couldn't explain. The house looked worse than I'd imagined. The roof sagged, the windows were broken, and the paint had peeled away, leaving the wood beneath gray and weathered. The front porch was tilted, the boards warped and splintered. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, left to rot under the weight of its history. Jake grabbed a flashlight from the car, his grin widening. "Let's check it out." I hesitated, glancing back at the car. "Maybe we shouldn't. What if it's dangerous?" "Come on," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "It's just a house. What's the worst that could happen?" I followed him up the porch, the boards creaking under our weight. The front door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges, and the smell hit me before we even stepped inside. A mix of damp wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic. The inside was worse. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shards of glass, and the remains of animals that had made their home there. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in graffiti, most of it crude and childish. But beneath the graffiti, I could see faded stains on the floor, dark, irregular stains that looked too much like blood. "Creepy," Jake said, shining the flashlight around. "You think this is where it happened?" I didn't answer. My mouth was dry, my heart pounding. There was something about the place, something wrong. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and every creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. We moved through the house slowly, Jake leading the way. The living room was empty, the fireplace cold and filled with ash. The kitchen was worse, with its rusted sink and broken cabinets. But it was the back room that stopped us in our tracks. The room was small and empty, but the temperature dropped the moment we stepped inside. The air was so cold I could see my breath fogging in front of me. And there, in the corner of the room, was a chair. It was old, the wood splintered and the seat sagging. But it wasn't the chair itself that scared me. It was the feeling that someone was sitting in it. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The weight of eyes on me, the sense that I was intruding on something I shouldn't. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. Jake didn't argue. For once, he looked just as scared as I felt. We turned to leave, but then we heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps on the floorboards above us. We froze, our eyes locked. The sound came again, louder this time, moving across the ceiling. And then came the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more distinct, a chorus of voices, overlapping and frantic, speaking words I couldn't understand. The air grew colder, heavier, and the walls seemed to close in around us. "Go!" Jake hissed, grabbing my arm. "Now!" We ran. The house seemed to shift as we moved, the shadows deepening, the walls groaning like a living thing. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more frantic. By the time we reached the front door, the whispers had turned into screams. High, piercing wails that echoed through the house and into my skull. We burst onto the porch, gasping for breath, and sprinted to the car. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and the engine roared to life. We tore down the driveway, the house disappearing into the trees behind us. Neither of us spoke on the drive home. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. But the road was empty, the darkness behind us impenetrable. I haven't been back to the Lawson house since that night, and I never will. Jake doesn't talk about it either, though I know he remembers. The house may be empty, but it isn't abandoned. Something is still there, something angry, something that doesn't want to be forgotten. Every Thanksgiving, when I sit down with my family, I think about that night. I think about the screams, the cold, and the weight of unseen eyes. And I wonder if Charlie Lawson is still sitting in that chair, waiting for the next fool to walk through the door. If you ever find yourself near that house, do yourself a favor. Stay away. Story number 8. Thanksgiving at the Crescent Hotel. Thanksgiving has always been a time of warmth and family for me, a day filled with good food and better memories. But one Thanksgiving, I spent the holiday working at the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, a place famous for its beauty and its ghosts. That holiday changed the way I think about Thanksgiving forever. The Crescent Hotel isn't just any old building. It's been a lot of things over the years. A luxury resort, a hospital for cancer patients run by a quack doctor, a women's college, and now it's a hotel again, though one that leans heavily into its reputation as America's most haunted hotel. Guests come for the history, for the rumors of spirits roaming the halls, and for the chance to say they spent a night with the dead. I didn't believe in any of it when I started working there. I figured the ghost stories were just marketing hype. I know better now. It was Thanksgiving night, and the hotel was quieter than usual. Most of the guests were in the dining room, enjoying their turkey and stuffing, while the staff bustled around trying to keep up. I was a part-time waiter at the time, saving up for college. The dining room was packed with families and couples, their laughter and conversation filling the air. Felt cheerful, warm, but the Crescent always has a way of reminding you where you are. I was assigned to clean up after the dinner service. which meant staying behind after most of the staff had gone home for the holiday. By 10 p.m., the dining room was empty, the guests retired to their rooms, and the lights dimmed. I was alone with a cart full of dirty dishes and a vacuum cleaner that barely worked. That's when the noises started. First, it was just the sound of footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible, like someone walking barefoot across the hardwood floor. I froze, listening. It was faint, distant, coming from the far end of the dining room near the stage where they sometimes hosted events. I told myself it was just my imagination, the sound of the old building settling, and went back to stacking chairs. Then came the whispers. They were low, barely audible, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was urgent, insistent, like whoever was talking didn't want to be overheard. I turned toward the sound, my pulse quickening. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty room. The whispers stopped. I stood there for a moment, gripping the back of a chair, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The air felt heavy, like the weight of a storm pressing down on me. I shook my head, muttering to myself, "Get a grip, man." I went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air was colder now, and every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old building playing tricks on me. And then I saw her. I was stacking chairs near the back of the room when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure, barely visible, standing near the entrance to the kitchen. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. She was dressed in a dark, old-fashioned gown, the kind you'd expect to see in a Civil War reenactment. With a high collar and long sleeves, her hair was pinned up, and her face was pale, almost translucent. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at something on the far side of the room, her head tilted slightly, as if listening. I wanted to call out, to say something, but my voice wouldn't work. My legs felt like lead, frozen to the spot. And then she moved. It wasn't a step. Exactly. It was more like she glided across the floor, her feet not quite touching the ground. She passed through the doorway into the kitchen and disappeared. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart hammering in my chest. Finally, I forced myself to move, to follow her. I don't know why I should have run, should have grabbed my things and gotten out of there. But something pulled me forward, some morbid curiosity I couldn't resist. The kitchen was empty. The air was colder here, the kind of cold that bites into your bones. And the light above the prep station was flickering. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing off the tiled walls. The silence was deafening, oppressive, and then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The door was closed, but no one was there. The whispers started again, louder this time, surrounding me, filling the room like a chorus of disembodied voices. My head was spinning, the air so cold I could see my breath fogging in front of me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single sound, a low, mournful sob, coming from the corner of the room. I turned slowly, my hands shaking. She was there again, crouched on the floor, her hands covering her face. Her shoulders shook as she wept, the sound soft but filled with despair. I wanted to help her, to ask her what was wrong, but my feet refused to move. And then she looked at me. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were empty sockets, black and hollow, and her mouth was twisted into a grimace of pain. She opened her mouth and let out a scream, a sound so loud and piercing it made my ears ring. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the kitchen, or how I ended up outside in the freezing night air. All I know is that I ran until I couldn't run anymore, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding like a drum. The next morning, I quit my job at the Crescent Hotel. I never told anyone what I saw that night, at least, not in detail. Who would believe me? But I know what I experienced. I know the Crescent isn't just a hotel. It's a place where the past lingers, where the dead can't or won't move on. Every Thanksgiving, when I sit down with my family, I think about that night. I think about the woman in the kitchen, the sorrow in her sobs, and the emptiness in her eyes. And I wonder if she's still there, waiting for someone else to hear her cries. If you ever find yourself at the Crescent Hotel, especially on Thanksgiving, remember this: not everyone at the table is alive. Story number 9. The Plymouth Massacre. Thanksgiving has always been my favorite holiday. There's something about the smell of roasting turkey, the warmth of family gathered around a table, and the crisp autumn air that feels timeless. But for me, Thanksgiving carries a darker memory, a memory that still chills me to my core. It happened 6 years ago when I lived in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Plymouth is a town steeped in history, the kind of place where the past feels alive. It's where the Pilgrims landed, where the first Thanksgiving was held, at least. That's the story we were taught in school. But Plymouth also has a darker side, a side that doesn't make it into the history books. I just moved there for a new job. I didn't know anyone, so when Thanksgiving rolled around, I decided to spend it exploring the area. I figured I'd go for a hike in the woods, enjoy the fall colors, and maybe take some photos. It sounded better than sitting alone in my apartment, eating a frozen dinner. The morning was perfect, clear, cold, with a light frost clinging to the leaves. I parked at a trailhead just outside town, near a patch of forest locals called Whispering Pines. I'd heard rumors about the place, stories of strange sounds, shadowy figures, and an oppressive presence that made your skin crawl. But I didn't believe in any of that. I thought it was just local folklore, the kind of ghost stories people tell to scare themselves. I should have listened. The trail was beautiful, winding through dense trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The ground was soft underfoot, muffling my footsteps, and the air was so still that every sound seemed amplified: the rustle of leaves, the distant caw of a crow, the rhythmic crunch of frost beneath my boots. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The light grew dimmer, even though it was still mid-morning. The air felt heavier, colder, and the trees seemed to press in closer, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. And then I heard it. It started as a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of the wind. First, I thought it was just the trees, their branches creaking and groaning in the cold. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, words spoken in a language I didn't understand, carried on the breeze like a mournful chant. I stopped, my heart pounding, and scanned the trees. There was no one there, just shadows and the shifting light filtering through the branches. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to circle me, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the whispers, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't words, exactly, but they carried a weight, a sorrow that made my chest tighten. I turned to head back, my unease growing with every step. But the forest had changed. The trail, which had been so clear before, seemed to have disappeared, swallowed by the underbrush. I tried retracing my steps, but the more I walked, the deeper I seemed to go. That's when I saw them. First, they were just shapes in the distance, dark figures moving between the trees, their forms barely visible through the thickening mist. My rational mind tried to explain them away. Deer, I thought, were shadows, but as they grew closer, I realized they weren't animals. They were people, or at least, they looked like people. Their clothes were strange, tattered, old-fashioned, like something out of a history book. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes, God, their eyes, they were hollow, empty, as if the life had been drained from them. They didn't move like normal people. Their motions were jerky, unnatural, as if they were being pulled along by invisible strings. And they were coming straight for me. I ran. I don't remember much about that sprint through the forest, just the sound of my own ragged breathing, the pounding of my heart, and the whispers that seemed to grow louder, angrier, with every step. The figures were everywhere now, flickering in and out of the mist, their hollow eyes watching, accusing. "Please," I gasped, though I didn't know who I was begging. "Please, let me go." The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and then came the screams, high, piercing wails that made my ears ring and my blood run cold. They were the screams of people in pain, of people dying, and beneath them, I could hear something else, the clash of steel, the dull thud of clubs, the wet, sickening sound of flesh and bone being torn apart. I stumbled into a clearing, my legs shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving only silence. I looked around, my vision swimming, and that's when I saw it. The ground was littered with bones, human bones, scattered among the leaves like the remnants of some ancient massacre. Some were old and weathered, others frighteningly fresh, their jagged edges gleaming in the pale light. And standing at the center of the clearing was a single figure. He was taller than the others, his clothes more intact, though stained with something dark. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unrelenting, piercing through me. He raised a hand, pointing at me, and though he didn't speak, I understood. "You don't belong here." I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, the whispers and screams chasing me like a living thing. Somehow, I made it back to the trailhead, though I don't remember how. My car was the only one in the lot, its windows fogged over from the cold. I jumped in, my hands trembling so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest was still, the mist curling around the trees like smoke, but standing at the edge, barely visible in the fading light, was the figure, watching, waiting. I left Plymouth a few months later, unable to shake the feeling that the forest was still watching me. Thanksgiving, once my favorite holiday, is now a day I dread, a reminder of what I saw, of what I felt. I don't know what haunts the woods near Plymouth. Maybe it's the spirits of the natives who were slaughtered there, or the settlers who died in brutal retaliation. Maybe it's something older, something tied to the land itself. All I know is this: if you ever find yourself in those woods, and you hear whispers on the wind, don't follow them, because they won't let you leave. Story number 10. The Haunted Thanksgiving in Salem. Salem has always been a town of whispers, the kind of place where the shadows seem a little darker, the air a little heavier. Everyone knows about the witch trials, the hangings, the hysteria, the blood-soaked history. But what most people don't realize is that Salem's darkness didn't end in 1692. It lingers, woven into the fabric of the town, waiting for moments when it can rise to the surface. I never believed in any of that, not until the Thanksgiving when it came to my door. It was 2007, and I had just moved into an old colonial house on the outskirts of Salem with my wife, Laura, and our 6-year-old daughter, Ellie. The house was the kind of place you'd see on a postcard, with its steep roof, weathered shutters, and sprawling oak trees. It was quiet, cozy, perfect for a fresh start. Thanksgiving that year was just the three of us. We'd moved too far from family to travel back for the holiday, and we were happy to keep things simple. Laura cooked a small turkey. Ellie made handprint decorations, and I uncorked a bottle of wine. It was a good day, normal, but Salem doesn't do normal for long. It started just after sunset. We were sitting at the table, finishing dessert, when there was a knock at the door. 3 loud, deliberate raps that echoed through the house. Laura and I exchanged a glance. "Who could that be?" she asked. "Maybe a neighbor," I said, though the thought made me uneasy. We hadn't met many people yet, and it seemed strange for someone to come calling on Thanksgiving night. I got up and went to the door. When I opened it, the porch was empty. The air was cold. The street silent except for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. But there, on the top step, was a silver plate. It was old, tarnished, and scratched. with a strange, intricate pattern etched around the edges. In the center, words were engraved in a language I didn't recognize. They looked like Latin, but the letters were warped, twisted, as if whoever had carved them didn't care if they made sense. Who was it? Laura called from the dining room. No one, I said, picking up the plate. But someone left this. When I brought it inside, Laura and Ellie leaned in to get a better look. Ellie reached out to touch it, but I pulled it away. Don't, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. We don't know where it came from. Laura frowned. Maybe it's some kind of prank? Maybe, I said, though something about the plate made my skin crawl. Felt heavier than it should have, and the air around it seemed colder, like the metal was leaching the warmth from the room. We left it on the kitchen counter and tried to put it out of our minds. But that night, couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside seemed magnified, like the walls were closing in. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft and deliberate, but when I got up to check, the house was empty, the shadows deeper than they should have been. The next morning, things got worse. I woke up to find Ellie standing in the kitchen, staring at the plate. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and she was whispering something under her breath. Ellie, I said, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I walked over and gently touched her shoulder. She blinked, snapping out of whatever trance she was in, and looked up at me with tears in her eyes. Daddy, she said, her voice trembling. The people, they're angry. My stomach dropped. What people? Sweetheart, the ones outside, she said. They're mad at us. I glanced out the window, but the yard was empty. The plate was still on the counter, its tarnished surface glinting faintly in the morning light. I grabbed it and shoved it into a drawer, slamming it shut. Laura came into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. What's going on? I don't know, I said, my voice tight. But that thing, we need to get rid of it. Laura nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. We agreed to take the plate to the Historical Society later that day, hoping someone there could explain it. But before we could leave, the knocking started again. 3 loud raps, just like the night before. I froze, my heart pounding. Laura grabbed Ellie and held her close, her face pale. I went to the door, every instinct screaming at me to leave it shut. But I opened it anyway. No one was there. This time, though, the plate was back. It was sitting on the porch, gleaming in the weak sunlight, even though I was certain I'd left it in the kitchen drawer. My hands shook as I picked it up, the strange symbols seeming to twist and writhe under my gaze. What do you want from us? I whispered, though I didn't expect an answer. That night, the nightmares began. I dreamed of shadowy figures, their faces obscured, their eyes glowing like embers. They stood around our house, whispering in that strange, guttural language, their voices rising and falling in an eerie chant. In the dream, I was holding the plate, and the symbols were glowing, pulsing like a heartbeat. When I woke up, the whispers didn't stop. They were faint, coming from somewhere deep in the house, like the walls themselves were speaking. Laura heard them too, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling. Even Ellie, who didn't fully understand what was happening, seemed to sense the wrongness in the air. We left the house that morning, driving to the Historical Society with the plate wrapped in a towel. The curator, an elderly man with sharp eyes and a knowing smile, took one look at it and frowned. "Where did you get this?" he asked. I explained, my voice shaking. He didn't say anything for a long time, just ran his fingers over the symbols, his expression darkening. "This," he finally said, "isn't something you should have." "What is it?" Laura asked. "It's a witch's offering plate," he said. "From the late 1600s. They were used in rituals, offerings to spirits. Or worse, if you've brought this into your home, you need to get rid of it. Immediately." "How?" I asked. "Can we burn it?" He shook his head. "No, bury it. Deep, and never go back to where you buried it. We did as he said, driving out to a remote part of the forest and digging a hole as deep as we could. When the plate was covered, the air seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight lifting. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. But Salem doesn't let go so easily. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear the whispers when I'm alone, faint, almost imperceptible, but there. And every Thanksgiving, I think about that plate, about the shadows that surrounded our house, and about the anger in Ellie's voice when she said, "They're mad at us." If you ever hear a knock at your door in Salem, and no one's there, don't open it. And if you find an offering plate on your doorstep, leave it where it lies. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed. Thank you for joining us on this haunting journey through the chilling legends of Thanksgiving. From mysterious visitors to cursed forests, these stories remind us that even a day of gratitude can be touched by the unexplained. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next dive into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, not every Thanksgiving guest comes with an invitation.